Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be joined with all of you, wherever you are in the world tonight, to celebrate the book Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. We are here with the author, Leslie Kern, and with the interlocutor, Evette Dionne. And I'm going to introduce Evette first. Evette is a journalist, pop culture critic, and magazine editor. She is the National Book Award nominated and Coretta Scott King honor author of Lifting as We Climb, Black Women's Battle for the Ballot Box. And she currently works in editorial and publishing at Netflix. Dionne is currently working on an essay collection for Echo that will be released in summer 2022. And as soon as we get that pre-order link, we will be dropping that for y'all. It's coming. We just don't have it yet. And of course, the person of the hour is Leslie Kern, who is an associate professor of geography and environment and director of women's and gender studies at Mount Allison University. She is the author of Sex and the Revitalized City, Gender, Condominium Development, and Urban Citizenship, and Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. I personally am super excited about this book and this event. I love the way we think about the built world and how that affects all of us as embodied humans and as gendered people and as raced people and all of those things. So I'm really thrilled that you're here with us tonight. We encourage folks, if you want to shout out where you're watching from, please do that in the chat. It's always useful, certainly as we're thinking about cities, to know what cities are represented. It's also great if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Ask a Question box at the bottom center of your screen at any time. Or if you want to put them in chat, if you're on your phone, that's also fine. I'll be sure to move them over. All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way, and we'll get this party started.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ER. Leslie, it is so lovely to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Congratulations. We are here to commemorate the paperback edition of this book. Yes. So congratulations. Let's start with how you're feeling. Like, how are you feeling? You've been on a long book tour at this point. Like, how are you doing?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing well. I mean, obviously, it's a book tour from this room, pretty much, in my house, which is the room that used to be my daughter's room before she moved out and went off to university. As I was saying to ER before we got started, that I guess one of the mixed blessings or the silver linings of the pandemic is that I've been able to talk to people and organizations and groups and book clubs all over the world, people who probably would normally not get an international author to come and visit them. And it's just been an amazing opportunity to connect with so many different people and groups. So I'm doing good, a little tired. It's a long teaching day today. We're like back in the classroom here at Mount Allison for the most part. So I've been spending a busy day talking about global cities and place, but I'm definitely ready to go and continue the conversation tonight.
Yeah, I'm so glad. And I feel the same way about pandemic, like the fact that we get to do this and we don't have to be in the same place and people can join us the world over is really fantastic. It's been a hard year, but that's been one of the highlights for me. Just so folks know, I don't know if you know this, but you can ask us any questions that you would like. There's an Ask a Question button at the bottom. Please, by all means, feel free to ask Leslie questions about this great book. So let's start here. And this is not a book-related question, but it is a subject expertise-specific question. For those who are unfamiliar, can we talk about feminist geography for a minute? Like, what is it? How did you come into the field? What was appealing about it to you? Like, let's talk about your expertise as a scholar.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great place to start because I absolutely recognize that for most people, the term feminist geography is not really like an intuitive putting together of two concepts. And I didn't, discover that such a thing existed myself until I went to graduate school. I think for me, when I kind of trace my interest going back, I've always been a city lover for sure. So I always kind of had a strong sense of connection to my hometown, which is Toronto, and really, kind of felt passionate about living in the city as a young woman, for example. And I was, for, at least since high school, I've been a feminist. And when in grad school, I, started to come across writers who were looking at questions of power, particularly in relation to gender, but in relation to other factors as well, like race and class and sexuality and citizenship. Through the lens of space, it was like, boom, here's this kind of literally like a third dimension for how to start to understand how power works and flows and impacts people in different situations. So essentially for me, feminist geography is a way of applying, a gendered analysis to questions of power, to gender roles and relations, but trying to understand the ways that the spaces around us, particularly like our built environments, both shape those relations and are also shaped by them in a kind of, cyclical kind of feedback loop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your book does an excellent job of that. My next question here in that realm is, how did this book come to be? And I ask that because you are a scholar, an expert, an absolute expert in the realm of feminist geography. And this book does such an excellent job of offering very rigorous research and also very compelling and vulnerable personal analysis, like you're mining your personal life and your experiences. So how did this book come to be? And were you at all concerned about bringing that personal into a book, a very good book, but a book that deals in your specific expertise?
Well, first of all, thank you for those very complimentary comments. I appreciate that. I think, okay, so this book kind of came to be in that I think, many of us have been witnessing what I think is a really great moment in kind of public feminist intellectual writing over at least the last 10 years, if not more. And I all of the work that I love to read by like Roxane Gay, Rebecca Solnit, Rebecca Traister, so many people who are bringing a feminist perspective to all sorts of questions about day-to-day life. And I was like, what could I contribute to this conversation? And I thought, I could bring space into it. I could bring the city into this conversation. And yeah, of course, all day long, I talk with students about these issues. I talk with other scholars, but my intention with this book was to make it a conversation that really anybody could start to have, to, for the average person who's just, getting on the subway to go to work and has never really thought about, okay, what's the gendered idea that's built into the timing and the route of this train, right? Most people are not really thinking about that question as they get on their way to work. So I wanted the book to be kind of like this little starting place for people to have that different way of looking around them. And I do think that one of the ways that we can do that as writers is to bring the personal into it. And of course, obviously drawing on an extremely long feminist tradition of starting from the personal, starting from the body, recognizing that sometimes it's in those seemingly mundane and everyday spaces and experience that we actually learn a lot about politics, about big picture forces. But I will admit that it did make me a little bit uncomfortable. I definitely have the security of tenure, so I wasn't worried about my job. I was more worried about my mom's gonna read this, and I'm kind of infamous among my friends for being that stereotypical secretive Scorpio who doesn't tell anybody anything.
Yeah,
likes to keep a lot of stuff just very close to my chest. So there were definitely a few moments where I was like, what am I doing here? This doesn't really seem like me. But, since the book came out, it has been worth it, because it is definitely a way that people connect, even if their experience doesn't look exactly like mine, but there are little things that people can relate to, or even for, people like my brother, for example, who I talk about in the book, but after he read it, he was like, yeah, now when I get on the subway and I look at people trying to travel with strollers and kids, I understand this in a totally different way. So I was like, okay, job done.
Absolute same. As someone who has never been pregnant, I read that first chapter and was like, man, have I ever been this insensitive? Likely. Yes, likely I have been. In that same realm, One of the things that I enjoyed deeply about your book, and it's something I love talking to other authors about, is the way in which you interweave pop culture analysis throughout the book. I mean, you reference Broad City, you talk about Sex in the City. I mean, so many iconic TV shows, movies, different musical moments. Like you really do bake that into your overall analysis. How do you think about pop culture in terms of the work that you're doing, and why was it important to include kind of tidbits and nuggets for readers who are coming into this subject matter for the first time?
Yeah, great question. I feel like it's definitely a risk of dating myself with all of my Sex and the City references, but I think, you know, particularly given the subject matter around gender and the city, that some of those conversations really started to enter the mainstream through pop culture, through representations like Sex and the City, where it seemed like people were suddenly, I don't know, discovering that women lived in cities and might like it, or might actually, you know, not be just pining for the day that they can move to the suburbs and settle down. And, you know, clearly that is not entirely new. That was not invented with Sex and the City, but maybe that was like a particular moment where that conversation kind of opened up. And I think since then, there's been more, and arguably like better, or at least more diverse and more kind of widely encompassing representations. But I think, you know, looking through that pop culture lens, it's yet another way to draw people in and, you know, to get them to connect. I think, you know, I'll just be honest, I kind of love doing that sort of analysis, although I'm not an expert in it. I'm not, you know, a cultural studies expert. So I know that there are people who can obviously do a much like deeper and more rigorous analysis than I can. But I know for me, like, let's face it, I mean, pop culture, as much as some folks might want to dismiss it, is a way that we come to understand the world around us. And in some cases, it's a way that we come to change the way that we think about the world around us. You know, good television shows and movies and novels can do that. So I think there's definitely a place to bring them into an academic conversation. And certainly lots of scholars, you know, look at these as well.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the reasons why I love books that do the work that you are doing is that for people who are new to this subject matter, it's instant connection. Like, oh yeah, I completely get that New York City is the fifth girl in Sex and the City. Like it makes an instant connection for people that is sometimes more difficult to grasp for them if they're just coming in without that kind of gateway, is what I call it. Your very first chapter in the book, after your intro, begins with a personal story about being pregnant with your daughter Maddie, navigating the city of London, and particularly London's public transportation as a pregnant person. And you write in that chapter that pregnancy and motherhood made the gendered city visible to you in high definition. Why was it important for your book to begin there? Page 1, page 2 to begin right there.
Yeah, I think, you know, the quote that you just read kind of, yeah, that's it. Because for me, that was the moment. And this was before I went to graduate school and knew anything about feminist geography. I had done a women's and gender studies undergraduate degree, but I had never really connected what I had learned in those courses to particular spaces. So it was really this moment where I had always experienced, I think, the city in a gendered way, primarily through the experience of, you know, catcalling, for example, or feeling fear in certain kinds of spaces, or knowing that I was supposed to feel fear in certain kinds of spaces. But that was more about, you know, the other people who are in the environment, in most cases, you know, other men. It wasn't really about the space itself. But when I was pregnant, and then when I had my daughter and she was, you know, a tiny baby and trying to move through the city, it was, now it wasn't just the people, but it was like, yeah, the systems, it was the infrastructure, it was the public transit, it was sidewalks, it was doors, it was toilets or the lack of toilets, it was the attitudes of the public that I could sort of sense around, why are you here? Why are you taking up space? Is this going to get messy and noisy? Is this going to be an experience that I don't want to have? And at that moment, I was like, oh, there's more to it than just sort of like cultural norms of behavior. There's actually a way in which the city is very much not designed around the needs of caregivers, pregnant people, and small children. So for me, that was an entry point. And of course, I had to acknowledge, and I mentioned this in the book, that it was a lot of privilege on my part that had kind of hidden that from me. And certainly, if I had navigated the city as a disabled person, as a senior citizen, prior to that, then the fact that buses are not accessible would have been very obvious to me. So it was, certain kinds of privileges that shielded me previously from that experience.
Yeah. And in reading the book, I felt that in terms of having the dawning realization that I specifically love when you're talking about breastfeeding and trying to find a place to do it. There are just certain aspects of a life that you don't consider until you have to live it. And I think everyone has that dawning moment at some point. And I love the fact that you were kind of grappling and reckoning with that. In that first chapter, you're writing a lot about the experience of being pregnant in public space. But you also talk about this idea, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing it because I do not speak French. Is it flaneur?
Yes.
Got it right.
Yep.
You talk about this concept and how it is, for the most part, been centered around men and more specifically white men. But now people are trying to reimagine it in new ways. But in relationship to pregnancy, you're saying that, pregnant people never are considered flaneurs. Why are pregnant people not included in the idea? And how does that help us understand the limits of the concept itself more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the defining characteristics of the flaneur is that ability to blend into the crowd, to be the quintessential spectator and to not be the spectacle, right? To not be the watched and the observed. In the, kind of like, I don't know, late 19th, early 20th century imaginings of the figure of the flaneur and the kind of, the growing, bustling cities, this was the person who would take everything in and who would, move through the urban scene, but without necessarily being noticed themselves or without standing out. So there's been a lot of debate since about even whether women could be the flaneur or the French feminine word flaneuse, and with, debates on both sides about, women often being objectified and watched. And so maybe not as able to blend in, and also women not as able to relax in urban space because we're being vigilant either about our safety or about our, virtue and propriety, I guess, if we go back a little further in time. And so then when you add pregnancy onto that, I think it's a common experience for pregnant people that people come up to you and comment. That's if you're lucky, they just comment on your pregnancy. But often people will, touch your belly or some other part of your body. They will ask the kind of personal questions that you would never, ask a stranger or even, an acquaintance or workmate in polite society before. So the pregnancy itself kind of becomes, I think I say in the book, you kind of become like a public body, and there's a certain amount of people feeling entitled to having like a public interest. Now you're a reproductive vessel, you are, reproducing society. So now we collectively have some interest in, what is going on in there, basically, whether it's about the, supposed sex of the fetus, whether it's about, when the baby's due, what you're eating, what vitamins you're taking, all those kinds of things. So under those conditions, the question of, could a pregnant person really be the flaneur? I think it's difficult. But, on the other hand, the flaneur is not I think the only ideal of, how to be a person in the city. It's just one that kind of has been around for a long time and was, when early sociologists were kind of trying to figure out like what is urban life, and how does living in the city affect human psychology. This was a sort of figure that emerged as like, oh, this is new, this is interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that was very striking to me about your book as I read it is that a lot of this feels akin to surveillance, particularly when you're talking about street harassment, which this is the first book that I've ever read. A lot of feminist writers have done a lot of work around street harassment and women's bodies being public. This was the first book that I've read in which you're talking about it being baked into the landscape. So can you talk a bit about how that surveillance and the treating of women's bodies in public spaces in cities is baked into the literal planning of a city, like into the literal creation of the city itself?
Yeah, I think what the crux of that, a lot of it has to do with just those very notions of public versus private, and the way in which at a certain point in time, there became, at least for, a middle or upper class strata of usually white women, a clear division between the public space of the city, the world of work, the street life, and the private space of the home, where women became, or femininity itself became, proper femininity became associated with the home. And so women being out in public, particularly as cities were, growing really rapidly and becoming more diverse and a lot more kind of class mixing and so on, because it wasn't quite possible spatially to maintain those divisions, that everyday citizens as well as cities themselves became kind of very invested in surveilling women's bodies, because there was sort of this question, like if women's virtue and morality and chasteness and status was going to somehow be sullied on the streets, this would also be like a referendum on whether the city itself was a good thing or whether it was going to be like the downfall of civilization. I think we know, for better or for worse, and in lots of really messed up ways, we often consider sort of the treatment of women as some kind of like the treatment of some women as the measure of what counts as being civilized. And so the idea that the city would be like both a dangerous place for women, but also probably more, at least in Victorian times, more seriously a place where women's purity and virtue could be sullied in some way. This was seen as like, well, if that's going to be the case, then the city is a problem. But clearly, yes, things have changed, but also maybe not that much over 100, 150 years, even though the language that we use might be different. We know that, women, now we have a different language for it. Things like rape culture, for example, that has a set of defining myths and a set of questions that women will be asked, or that they might even ask themselves, like, what were you doing in that place? What were you wearing? Why weren't you with your friends? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Should, something, some kind of violence or harassment or even just fear crop up in urban places? I think we also have all sorts of other surveillance that's been primarily targeted to lower income women and women of color around, I don't know, the horrible stereotype of like the welfare queen, for example, that was used to kind of police women's work, women's fertility, women's families, and so on. Even today, the debates that we have about things like health and obesity often target women as like somehow either it's women's fault for not taking care of their families in particular ways, but I think we can still see these kind of lineages of surveillance. And I think I've gotten away from your question, which was about like how it's actually in the landscape itself. But again, I think even though certain things have shifted to some extent, the division of public and private, like it's still with us today, right? And it's still impacting what we see as kind of the proper place of women. It's not as strict as it once was. But certainly, you know, during the pandemic, oh, lo and behold, we find out, oh yeah, women are still doing the majority of unpaid labor in the home, for example, right? Oh, shock, discovery of this reality. And, you know, that is in part because of these like ongoing, you know, spatial separation of what we consider to be the place of care work. Absolutely. And the place of women. Yeah.
Absolutely. We may have answered a bit of this question, but I do see we have a question from Rin. I hope that I am pronouncing that correctly. If I am not, my sincere apologies. The question is, I think the idea of having a public body as you compared it to a pregnant person is really interesting. Could you talk more about other kinds of public bodies and what processes render certain bodies public?
Well, I think we could start by thinking about which bodies, you know, even if we go back to the flaneur, like which bodies can kind of seamlessly blend in or who are seen as the universal standard, right? The norm, the bodies that we never question their right to be in really any space, their access to spaces, their comfort in spaces. And for the most part, at least in the kind of, you know, global north, Western cities that I think we're talking about here, that has tended to be, you know, a cisgender, able-bodied white man who is both taken, you know, in policy and planning as the norm around which we're going to design society. And so, oh, shocking coincidence, the city actually functions quite well for him, and he kind of blends in a way because things have already been made to like literally fit his body, right? The design of, I don't know how high the bar is on the subway car, for example, the office temperature, the amount of like wind shear in a wind tunnel that a body is supposed to be able to absorb. These are all calculated with the idea of a standard male body, which certainly also doesn't represent all men, but is considered to be universal. So then this question of who comes to be a public body, well, anybody who gets marked as different, right, who deviates from that in really any number of ways. So disabled people, right, seniors, people of color, queer people, trans people, people who are poor, right, people who have some kind of identity marker that sets them apart from that norm. It seems to give some kind of license for society to, you know, surveil, to police, to enact violence against those bodies. And part of the justification, right, of that violence is those bodies being out of place, right? They're not where we expect them to be, or they're doing things in public that mainstream society would say, oh, well, don't do that in public, right? Don't, you know, maybe you can be that way in private, but you can't be like that on the street.
Right. I hope that was really helpful, Rin. Thank you so much for your question. And feel free to continue to ask questions. If I see them pop up, I will make sure that they get answered while we have Leslie here with us. I absolutely, okay, I may be dating myself too, but I am a huge fan of Sex and the City. Anyone who's ever followed me online knows this. I have a lot of opinions. It is my show. It's one of those shows I still watch now, like it's happening in current times. I'm not very happy about this reboot, but we continue. I loved your chapter about friendship among women in cities, and not only because it references Sex in the City, but also because it's something that I think many women of this time, myself included, are thinking a lot about how we can decenter romantic relationships in our lives. And one of the things that you write in that chapter is that although female friendship is often overlooked in favor of a focus on romantic partnerships, it is a powerful force that women rely on in multiple ways. Completely agree. Why was it important to include a chapter specifically about friendship, which was not something I would expect going into the book? And how can women's friendships help us reimagine the purpose of cities and how they function?
Well, I think the initial purpose of including the chapter was really like a selfish purpose, like this is my book, it's kind of about my life. Right. And And when I think about the female friendships that in my life have kind of lasted the longest, they were kind of forged in the experience of being young women, kind of independent and on our own for the first time and living in the big city. And yes, like you, I won't deny the kind of like influence of Sex in the City, both in good ways and bad ways on my thinking about cities. And yeah, I had to work that in there in some way. But as I wrote that chapter, and I if I recall correctly, this is one of the chapters that I really, I had a draft of, and then I had to rewrite it a couple of times because it kind of kept evolving. It didn't seem like it was enough to just say, well, women can kind of cement their friendships in cities, and cities can be important sites for friendship. I don't think that's like a whole chapter per se. But what started to evolve was, and out of that, okay, if we're going to decenter romantic relationships or, the nuclear family, the long-term monogamous relationship, what are we talking about and what are its potential like ripple effects? It's not just that, friendship is nice and we like to have friendship, but I think it's much more potentially radical than that. It is about, reshaping the way, for example, that we do care work, right? We've kind of structured care work to happen primarily still by women within the traditional nuclear family and within this physical item that we call the home, right? That is still in most cases designed as a single family unit, right? That's still the dominant form of housing, although it has not always been that way. And that is not universally true, but in many of our kind of global north cities, it is the case. So if we start to shake that up, if we say, what are some other ways that people might what are some other relationships that people might prioritize, friendship being one of them, it starts to shake those foundations, right? The very system that upholds capitalism, basically, which is that we have all of this unpaid labor that happens invisibly, or when it's visible, it's very poorly paid, right? All of that props up the rest of the system. So if we start to mess with the relationships and the spaces that make that possible, like all sorts of scary, wild things can happen. So to me, that was sort of the more, like, eventually the more interesting direction that chapter went in. And even, I think I tongue-in-cheek kind of imagine like the Sex in the City women some time on when they've kind of like pretty much abandoned their heterosexual relationships and now they just all live permanently in Miranda's Brooklyn brownstone together.
Dream.
Yeah, exactly.
The dream. We will never see it. Mr. Big is never going to go away, but a girl can dream.
Exactly.
In that same chapter, and it also brought up a different question for me that I'll ask after this question. But in that chapter, you write about all of the ways that women rely on one another to provide support, and not just, you mentioned like not just emotional support, but material support, elder care, transportation, housing, healthcare, so many things that have historically been associated with a nuclear family. Like now friends are providing it for one another. As I was reading that, I was just snapping, I was highlighting, yes, like nodding my head so much at that. Do you ever foresee a time when planners and the people who are thinking about how cities should be built will take that into consideration and center it as they're thinking about what a city should be?
Oh, I love that question. Maybe if there is an even worse crisis than the crisis that we've currently lived through. I mean, I think we've seen during the pandemic the rise or the recognition of things like mutual aid, which, definitely have a long history in cities, but more people started to hear about it and get involved in mutual aid. But, I kind of think like the thing that might eventually push that is honestly like the climate crisis, because in many ways, the way that we live in these little boxes of, very small kind of family units and so on, it's not efficient. It's not really very environmentally sustainable. It's actually, quite wasteful, and it's quite like energy intensive and so on. So there might become a time where it's just like literally not possible given the resources that we have, or given, I don't know, the fact that half of the city is underwater now or something, that we do have to radically change that. Of course, I hope it doesn't like come to that point, but it is so frustrating because, you know, not only, yeah, in the book I talk, okay, you know, women kind of like rely on one another, but if I think about, you know, reading like Bell Hooks and Patricia Hill Collins talking about how in Black communities, the nuclear family, I mean, first of all, people were denied the ability to even kind of like have that model of the nuclear family, but there's long been other sorts of like communal structures of care. So, you know, these things are not new, and they have not only existed historically, but they continue to exist today, but they exist in the kind of communities that we then like pathologize for having those sorts of relationships. We say there's something wrong with you for not aspiring to the nuclear heterosexual family. So I think it really requires both like turning the gaze to different ways of doing things, but like, yeah, it may need something as serious as a crisis to actually bring it into the mainstream.
Which is disappointing, because had we had it in the mainstream all along, but I digress. I digress. Yeah. That when we were talking about this chapter, it brought up this question for me about one of the reasons I deeply enjoyed reading your book is that you start somewhere at the beginning of a chapter and you end up somewhere entirely else, but everything else is threaded together in this beautiful way that you don't get lost, which, if nobody has told you before, is absolutely an art form. And you, superb job there. How do your pieces come together? Like, when do you know, okay, I've gone too far out and I need to come back in? How do you know when this is not enough and I need to go further out? Like, how did these chapters come together?
Whew. Well, thank you for saying that, first of all, because I think, you know, sometimes when I look back on the process of writing this book, I think, well, I should have been like even paying more attention to the craft of it, and, you know, not just like trying to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall to see what stuck. I guess I would, to the extent that I agree with you that that it worked where it did, and again, thank you for saying that. I would say it's because of what I've learned from reading, you know, feminist writing for decades now, which is that you can start somewhere that might seem like totally banal and uninteresting, of little significance or importance in the wider world, and yet that moment in time, that place, that look, that experience, that emotion can then, you know, lead us to all sorts of much bigger questions, and then can kind of take us on a journey to exploring something different. So I think, you know, in many ways it was not even always conscious, but I would think, I hope that over all my decades of reading so much feminist literature that I've like absorbed it and come to embody it. I think I would also be remiss without crediting my editor at Between the Lines Books, which was my initial Canadian publisher, Amanda Crocker, who, you know, read through the drafts and was really helpful in kind of giving me feedback and keeping me on track, because as you well know, Evette, a book is never a completely individual project as much as one person's name gets stuck on the front of it.
Absolutely. It's a communal project. Absolutely. My book is completely different now than it was when I started writing it. And that's perfectly fine. That's the way things come together. Yeah. Before we move on and talk about other parts of the book, you talk in this chapter about women's friendships, specifically about teenage girls, about young girls and young women, and young girls and young women being completely ignored in architecture and planning in terms of how cities are built. Why would you say that is? Is it like a chicken and egg situation where, because we're a society that doesn't in general pay attention to teenage girls or consider teenage girls frivolous, that we don't prioritize them in planning? Or is it because teenage girls are kind of inheriting a city that already exists? Like, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think, well, Probably a little bit of both. Probably also, when we think about the attention that is kind of given to young people in the city, it's often about seeing them as problems or as potential problems, right? Like if they don't have enough after school activities, then, they're going to be drawn into the life of crime or drugs or whatever, right? So we see that, but often, the figure that is really at the center of that imagination is a young man, right? Like, or, a preteen boy, right? Who's kind of like on the cusp of being in all this kind of trouble. Whereas the trouble that we imagine for girls is more things happening to them, right? Rather than them being the instigators of trouble. Now, of course, that differs across race and class. It's, there's nuances there, but for the most part, we kind of see teenage girls as like not as problem actors in the city. So we're not creating spaces to like save them from this like fate of crime and delinquency and vandalism or whatever it is that we fear that young men are about to get up to. I mean, I think it's also like, there's just lots of stereotype and bias. I mean, you mentioned the word frivolous, which I talk about in my book as well, where the things that girls are interested in, even though they like drive billion-dollar pop culture industries, are not seen as valid or valuable. So we just kind of like don't pay attention, don't care, or we somehow assume that like the world of girls is all like mysterious and doesn't really have any like spatial element to it. But interestingly, there are organizations and even architecture firms that are attempting to do something about this. In the UK, there's a nonprofit that's called Make Space for Girls that is both doing a bunch of research, first of all, like because we haven't even really like talked to young women about what kind of public spaces they want. So they're doing that research, and then they're, presenting what they found to developers, to city councils, to planners, and saying, okay, when you're designing that park, like what the recreation area is, it can't just be a football pitch, right? Like it can't just be basketball courts. You've got to factor in these other sorts of spaces as well.
Yeah, I love when you were talking about that and you were like, whenever we start talking about we're going to build this new open space for children, it's always a basketball court. Like that is true.
Always. It's a skate park.
It's a skate park. It's a hockey rink. It's never, if I had the foresight to know that unicorns would be $1 billion business, unicorns and slime, I would have opened Claire's a long time ago.
Yeah.
You make it very clear in a specific chapter about gentrified cities and suburbia not relieving women of much. Like you can leave a city and go to a suburb and your duties and responsibilities are the same. And you talk about feminist cities becoming care-centered. So that like the city has the potential to, I think you say, like spread the care work more evenly among people. How do cities consider care work right now, if at all? And what would it look like to have a feminist city that is care-centered?
Yeah, I think for the most part, your average city plan, especially in North America, does not really consider care work at all. Sometimes I, out of some weird boredom, when I look up a city plan, and I'll kind of Google or I'll search within the document for words like care.
Yeah.
And it's like nowhere, right? It's kind of nowhere in the public planning process. Now, I will say that some cities, through various other kinds of interventions that they're imagining, so like Paris's 15-minute city thing that they're talking about right now, one of the kind of prongs, if you will, of the 15-minute city is spaces of care. So there is kind of a recognition that putting things in close proximity is a way of helping to manage various care responsibilities, right? Like when things are spread out and highly distant and you can't connect the space of school and the home and leisure and work together, then that's a huge burden for caregivers. So proximity is one way of doing that. So I think it is out there, but there's still a long way to go. I think often it is an afterthought. So really, For me, a lot of my thinking about this has expanded during the pandemic because, again, going back to what I said earlier, this kind of like, realization, all this care work being done in the home and how overwhelming it is even in normal times. And then you add on all the extra layers that have happened during the pandemic and so many women, being pushed out of the workforce and all of the, just unreal burdens that so many families have faced. Think, okay, well, like what can we do about this? It's not just like, hey, heterosexual men, do more in the home. Like,
right.
Yes, if
Please
you
do.
fall amongst that demographic,
Please do.
however much you think you're doing, it's not as much
as you could be or should be doing.
Exactly. So do more. Like, that's great. Let's do that. But we can't stop there, right? First of all, not everybody is in that kind of household, first of all, right? Like that's not everybody. And increasingly, that is not even the majority of people who kind of live in that situation, at least not for their entire lives. So we need to make use of all of the both amazing spaces and services that cities can provide to start to collectivize care work. So, can we imagine taking, and we have seen this to some extent in the pandemic, like we've turned, basketball stadiums into mass sites of food production for healthcare workers, right?
Yeah.
Like we've repurposed public spaces, or we've rediscovered some public spaces as we've been encouraged to be outside more. Now we need to do a lot to improve them, because I think a lot of us have found like, there's nowhere to go to the bathroom, or there's nowhere to sit because we're afraid of terrorism and homeless people. So we don't have benches anymore, right? But we can use those spaces in different ways, and not just for sidewalk cafes, although sure, those are fun, but we can use them for sites of gathering. We can use them as sites of education, as sites of, feeding people, as connecting people together. And I think, part of the reason that we continue to undervalue care work is because for the most part, it is hidden away. If we bring it into public, if we cast the light on it, if we all start to recognize like both the skill involved, the labor involved, the, emotional work involved, then we might start to value it more, both financially, but also just like collectively, remove some of the stigma of doing care work. And as I said before, this recognition that this thing that we call the economy, it doesn't exist without that labor. Yeah.
It does not exist without the labor of caregivers. Absolutely, positively, 100%.
Yeah.
Does not exist.
Yeah.
Your section about public restrooms, I'm glad that you mentioned that in your last answer there, because as someone, I'm very open about like being chronically ill. I take a lot of Lasix every day. The first thing I look for if I'm going somewhere is a restroom. I need to know where the bathroom is at, because I'm going to go 5 times in an hour. But the way in which you talk about bathrooms piqued my interest, because I had never thought about it that way before, which happens to me a lot reading your book, to be quite honest with you and myself. How are bathrooms, what are we missing when we talk about public restrooms, and how do they become kind of ground zero for these bigger conversations that you are having and other feminist geographers are having about planning?
Yeah, I mean, just going from what you said, there are a lot of people for whom the knowledge of where the next bathroom is absolutely critical in their day-to-day survival. I mean, to some extent it is for all of us, but the urgency of it, for example, varies greatly. And then, of course, the kind of bathroom that you need to access, whether that is, physically accessible for people with disabilities, whether that is, all gender bathrooms or family bathrooms or bathrooms with care stations, bathrooms where you can change menstrual products, like all of those different factors. Like a porta potty is not going to do it for for everybody, right? Actually, for relatively few people. So it's not just a question of like comfort, although comfort I think is very important, but it is a question to me of like, how do we get the most people possible to participate in public life. And if some people are prevented, even kind of indirectly from doing that because they don't know that they have a safe, comfortable, accessible place to use the bathroom, then we're actually, limiting people's ability to kind of be part of the citizenry, if you will, right? To be part of this thing we call the public, right? Which is kind of the people that we recognize as fellow like citizens and city dwellers. So for all of those people who are just literally not out and about in various ways, I probably sounded very Canadian saying a minute ago. It's to me, it's like a democracy issue, when you are, again, it might be indirectly, maybe nobody is sitting up there in the planning office going, ha, 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 we're taking away toilets and therefore people with Crohn's disease will not, come and be part of the public realm. But indirectly, that is the impact. That's the effect that we're having. So it's very anti-democratic. And ultimately, so much of the way that cities approach bathrooms, it's an entirely kind of like fear-based approach. Instead of thinking about what bathrooms could do for the city, like, what they would enable, what they would afford for so many people, we are terrified of drug use, sexual activity or sex work, homelessness, crime that could potentially occur in these spaces. And so we've decided that those fears are going to rule us and our policy. And, that's it.
I say all the time, I talk about this all the time. I cannot imagine if people were trying to introduce libraries today. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if the federal government said, we are going to designate funds? The federal government of the United States said, we're going to designate funds for these public free spaces where you can get educated, you could check out books for free, you can lounge around all day if you have nowhere else to be. We're going to give you children's programming, restrooms. Sometimes they have cafes where they're giving out snacks. No way. They would call it socialism, and we wouldn't have libraries. That is what that is.
That is so true. And that's why we have to defend those spaces now, right? We can't take them for granted because, in many places they're being, decimated by either slow or fast budget cuts. And I mean, we've all heard those kind of debates, but yeah, I mean, libraries are almost like a last stand of, true public space and public service provision in the city.
Absolutely. Agreed. I just want to remind folks, if you have a question, by all means, please ask. I'm glad to continue to ask questions, but I would love to hear from other folks if you have questions as well. Your final chapter, critical, because for those who, I hope I'm not spoiling if you haven't gotten to the last chapter, but the final chapter is about how women, particularly white women, are socialized to understand fear and the ways in which cities enact policies around that supposed fear. And I have several questions in this realm, but it was the chapter I would say that surprised me the most. I did not expect to read it. I did not expect to get through the way the book is structured, like friendship and alone time, and then to get to fear. It was a good surprise. Like, this is a great way to close this particular book. Why was it important to end this book with that chapter?
Well, I think in many ways, I didn't want to kind of start the book being all about fear, because fear is not the only experience that women have of cities, yet we can't ignore it, because not only does it continue to kind of structure and shape women's lives, but as you mentioned, it the idea of, female fear actually has a broader impact on policy and planning itself, in policing, in the kind of spaces that are provided, in like pro-gentrification policies and rhetoric. This is it kind of filters and winds its way through so many things. So for me, part of my research as an academic, I study gentrification. So it was a way of kind of like bringing all of these different things together, bringing a, concern about like policing and the prison industrial complex kind of into the book. So a way of like just, pulling all this stuff together towards the end.
Yeah. One of the things that you write in this chapter is that making cities seem safe for women also tends to make them less safe for marginalized groups. I love that. I love that you said that plainly and clearly for folks. As we're envisioning feminist cities, like how can people who are planning these cities avoid leaning into those up to this point that have been realities, but really assumptions about safety for women? Like how can they avoid leaning into that and replicating it?
Yeah. Well, one way is just, to me, like a straight up reality check, which is that still the vast majority of violence against women happens in the private space of the home and from people that are known to them, from family members and intimate partners. So when we truly think about, if a city, if a society, if a nation really actually wants to do something about violence against women, it has to first tackle that problem, not the stranger in the dark alley. Although if there is a hostile stranger in the dark alley, we should care about that too. But like that reality check of just where violence against women really happens, it's in the home. And so to me, I think a lot of the time, the emphasis on, public danger and kind of public safety measures, particularly policing, it's really just a show. I don't think, I'll just be frank, maybe, it's late here, I'll just say it. I don't think they actually care really at all about violence against women. I don't think that they do, especially if you are not a white middle class woman, they do not care. Absolutely. So, and as I say, if they cared, there would be, low cost affordable housing for everybody, for example, because that would do a lot to ameliorate violence in the home if people could leave, right, and had somewhere to go, like just for an example. So that's what kind of one way of directing, I guess, that attention is just to kind of call that reality check to it. But, also, honestly, like I don't know, maybe somebody will show me a statistic that proves me wrong, but I doubt it. Has increased policing, decreased violence against women in any realm, in any place, in any city. Not that I know. Again, if somebody has that that data, like show it to me. I'm interested to see it. But the kinds of things that cities come up with around public safety, to me, they just divert funds to male-dominated, violent institutions that are violent against poor people and people of color, but also towards women. Like police forces, they're violent towards their own women officers. Like they are just inherently violent institutions. So I think if you want to eliminate violence, then the way to do that is not with more violence, right? Or with more money for more violence. Ultimately, it has to come down to, housing, to childcare, to reproductive health services and choice in reproductive health. It has to come down to, education, all of those things that kind of create safety from the ground up for the widest number of people, not top-down safety that honestly, even I think for relatively privileged white women, I don't think it even does much for those of us who fall into that category. Quite frankly, in my own life experience, it has not. So I just think there's no evidence for it. And so if we care about evidence-based policymaking, then we can't go in that direction.
Absolutely, false sense of security.
Yeah.
The book I recommend most to folks is called At the Dark End of the Street. I recommend it all the time. It reimagines the civil rights movement to focus specifically on how violence against Black women is the catalyst for the civil rights movement. Every person should read it and then think about their relationship to the police and why that is the way it is. Last question here for you. And it's a broad question. You can take it anywhere you would like. What does a feminist city look like, and what will it take to achieve it? Is there one that exists already? Let's start there. Is there one that exists already? If not, what will it take to achieve a feminist city?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think nobody has shown me the perfect example of it yet. I guess, you know, we would probably already be moving there, you and I, if it did, maybe at this moment. I do think that there are cities that are doing maybe better or being at least more explicit in an attention to gender equity and trying to build gender equity into their policy making through, you know, what we call gender mainstreaming practices. Certainly there are like good examples of projects from like lots of Scandinavian and other European cities. But to me, you know, the feminist city, the ideal, the vision, the utopia, you know, we've already talked about care. So to me, it has to be a place that is care centered, that recognizes the value of that work and that does everything possible to spread that work around so that it is not, you know, made invisible or overburdened on the shoulders of certain groups of people. It also has to be, you know, an environmentally sustainable place, because if we don't do that, then there's kind of no point in doing the rest of it as well. It has to also, you know, take an intersectional approach, because as we've just been talking about with the example of violence, that if you just kind of, you know, look at the experiences of, say, one narrow group of women, then you're likely to do harm to other groups of people. So you have to try to, as much as possible, have that intersectional vision of what it looks like. And what else could I say about it? I mean, you know, I think to me, almost, you know, learning so much over the last year and plus from Black Lives Matter and prison abolition movements, like, to me, I find so much hope in those visions, right? Because those are visions where that are about interdependence and care, that are about creating societies where people have their needs met, and assuming that when that is the case, then harm will be automatically reduced, right? And that when harm does occur, then we can find other ways of dealing with it than through other, you know, violent forms like policing or incarceration. So I think the vision of the feminist city also overlaps a lot with that abolitionist vision as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have one final question here from Edith. Thank you for your question, Edith. Edith said, do you find a contrast between the United States and Canada's engagement on these fronts? And by, I think at the time this question was asked, we were talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, Edith, we were talking about specifically police, the way in which we engage with police and police as a form of protection for women.
Mm-hmm. I think there's actually not that much difference. I think in Canada, we like to think that we have kind of a like softer, less racist, discriminatory system here, but we don't. You know, we also have shocking statistics about police violence against people of color, people with mental illness, people with disabilities. And we also have, you know, I mean, just a few years ago, reporter Robin Doolittle from Toronto did this whole series where she investigated claims that reported sexual assault, which we know is only the tip of the iceberg, right? Like assault that is actually reported to the police. And vast numbers of it, police had classified as unfounded, right? Which can mean all sorts of things, but essentially it means it's not going to be further investigated. So, you know, even when women do go to the police, the, you know, response that they're met with is extremely lackluster in most cases. So, you know, I'm sure that there are some differences, but I think in general, like we, you know, big cities here have a very, you know, we love the police here too.
That is, you know, it's not an American problem, unfortunately. It's a global problem, much to my chagrin and everyone else's. Yeah. Thank you so much, Leslie. It has been a real treat to talk with you about Feminist City. We're going to welcome ER back in to talk through last things. But thank you so much. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
No, thank you, Evette. Those were amazing questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I really enjoyed that. So I want to encourage folks to click this teal link at the bottom center of the screen to buy the new paperback version of Feminist City directly from Karis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. I also put the link to Evette's book, Lifting as We Climb, in the chat, so you can buy that directly from us, as well as the book that you referenced At the Dark End of the Street, which is a book that Karis has really loved and referenced for many, many years. We really recommend folks read it. So if somehow that missed you when it came out, please do go back and check that book out, because it is so really canonical. And if it's not already a part of your canon, it should be. Leslie, one of the things that we are always still sort of saddened and shocked by is how breastfeeding parents come into Karis, a feminist bookstore, and ask, is it okay for me to breastfeed here? Is it okay, is it okay for me to bring my children in here? And I'm like, if you can't breastfeed here, like where can you, And so it really has always made me think about how inhospitable the rest of the world is, if that is the question, right? And so I appreciate the way that that this book is raising attention to the intersectionality of all of these issues. So thank you both so much. I hope that you stay safe and well. And I'll be adding captions to this and putting it up on our YouTube channel. So you can be on the lookout for that in the next couple of days. Our YouTube channel is just youtube.com/Karis Circle. So thank you both so much. Have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.